Okay. Thanks to everyone for attending today's seminar. A little background about the seminar today. In preparation of phase 2, COFFIES has set up 3 themes for its science goals. Those are the theme of tachocline, theme of flux transport and emergence, and theme of near-surface shear layer. Today, we have invited the theme leads to give a review about flux transport and emergence theme, its goals and objectives, and its projected milestones. So today's speakers will be Dr. Bill Abbett and Dr. Aimee Norton. Dr. Bill Abbett is a senior fellow and research physicist at the Space Science Laboratory at UC Berkeley. Bill has a variety of interests in the field of astrophysics, including the formation and evolution of magnetic fields in the convective interior of the Sun and other stars, the dynamic connection between magnetic fields existing below the visible surface of the Sun and those observed in the solar corona. He is also interested in the physics of magnetically driven eruptions in the corona and the transport of radiation in the optically thick layers of stellar atmosphere during flares. He co-developed the global radiative MHD code RAD-MHD, which is designed to evolve active region scale magnetic fields through the solar convection zone to corona system. And the other speaker, Dr. Aimee Norton, is a senior research scientist at Stanford University. She is interested in using observations of magnetic fields in the solar photosphere to study the dynamics of sunspots and MHD waves. She is also interested in researching flux emergence processes, the solar dynamo, and the solar activity cycle. Aimee has also recently served as a science editor for the Astrophysical Journal. Okay, let's thanks to our welcome our speakers again, and let's have them start the seminar.
Well, thanks very much. So a quick disclaimer here. As we were preparing the talk, it occurred to me, initially that maybe I should give a more detailed scientific review about the physics of flux emergence in the interior. And that is a really, really broad topic and beyond the scope, I think, of what we were asked to do, which is really to summarize the COFFIES flux transport and emergence theme. So after talking with Aimee, as we were preparing the talk, we decided to kind of do it in 2 stages here. I'll start out with kind of a brief summary of the FT&E theme, and so it's kind of a programmatic talk a little bit, just to kind of remind ourselves for those and introduce the theme for those that may not be familiar with it. And then Aimee's going to talk about some specific science related to the theme that's specific to active delta spots. So it'll be kind of a 2-part extravaganza here. So I guess let me start out really quickly with kind of a 30,000 feet overview of flux transport and flux emergence, and why we care and why it's important to the solar dynamo. I think that there's a sentence there that starts out that's actually in our phase 2 proposal, and it's a bit obvious, but I like it because it just kind of says why things are important. And basically, everything we see at the visible surface of the sun and in the corona over a huge range of spatial and temporal scales really is the result of this process of magnetic flux emerging through being generated and emerging through the deep interior, and ultimately emerging through the visible surfaces of the sun so we can see it through remote sensing observations. So COFFIES is a really broad effort, and as it was mentioned before, it's organized into 3 overarching themes: the tachocline, flux transport, and emergence, and the near-surface shear layer. But these themes are ultimately connected together, right? I mean, it's hard to kind of separate them, and I think it's fair to say that the transport of magnetic flux through the interior is kind of connective tissue that serves to kind of put all these things together. So a lot of the overview here kind of touches on some issues with the tachocline and the near surface shear layer, but it's really impossible to talk about the emergence of flux without kind of delving into those other themes as well. But anyway, so where is this flux that emerge? Where does it come from, of course? Well, it comes from the dynamo processes operating in the turbulent convective interior. And those processes happen at large and small scales. And how do we characterize that? Well, obviously, many years of observations of emerging flux puts important constraints on our understanding of this field and of the convection zone itself and of the global solar cycle dynamo. One of the interesting things about flux emergence in the way that we think about it, both from an observational point of view and theoretical point of view, it's interesting that as these fields emerge through the surface and active regions evolve and decay, they seem to decouple. If we think of them as having subsurface moorings, structures below the surface, sometime during the decay process, it kind of gets messed up and uncoupled from that, and surface flows then seem to be a good guide to the evolution of flux patterns. And for example, like flux transport models and stuff like that. And all of this is important to understanding theories of the dynamo and the solar cycle. And in particular, this dispersal process is important, such that, for example, after a flux emerges and decays, the leading polarity of an on average, a flux is transported towards the equator, leading to cross-equatorial cancellation, and the following polarity fluxes are transported poleward. And this flux, that basically reverses the large-scale polar field. And this flux is pumped back into the differentially rotating interior, producing the toroidal fields of the next cycle, or that's one way to look at things. So the challenge really is to try to understand the physics of these processes well enough to be able to make transformative progress in our understanding of the solar cycle dynamo. So now at a more granular level, so we're kind of going from 30,000 feet maybe down to 25,000 feet or 10,000 feet. Basically, we want to understand in particular the physics of the storage, generation, and emergence of flux from all the way from the tachocline through the deep interior, turbulent interior, to the near surface shear layer, and actually well enough through the visible surface so we can compare things with observations in a more physically self-consistent way. And this entire process to date is, we understand things at a kind of a global level, but the real detailed physics of this is not really well understood. And at least from a theory and computational point of view, the reason is that it's a super challenging problem in that it covers a huge range of spatial scales and physical regimes that are quite a challenge, and we haven't really gotten to the point where we can have this, one model, to rule them all yet. So the way of thinking about it over the past decades, we referred to in the proposal as a standard model. And the basic idea of, how do we think of flux below the surface, and how do we get it to emerge in such a way as to follow observational principles like Joy's law and Hale's polarity law and so forth. And the idea for many years is that strong toroidal fields are basically generated from weak poloidal fields at or near the tachocline, where there's the presence of significant shear, and field can be stored for the time scales necessary to match the observed solar cycles. And so the idea is that through either magnetic instabilities or some sort of dynamic instability due to the turbulent downdrafts of convection, these toroidal fields are then unstable and then can produce coherent magnetic structures. And these structures are buoyant, magnetically buoyant, and then are able to rise through the convection zone and emerge bodily through the near surface layers in such a way that's consistent with all of these observed properties. And so this is kind of like the flux tube picture, or if you prefer, omega loop picture that's was studied pretty extensively over the past couple of decades. But that's not the only picture, of course. I mean, it can explain a lot of things, but there's a lot of details that it may or not explain very well. And so more recently, in the simulation community, there's other ways of thinking about how active regions can form rather than that kind of standard flux tube isolated magnetic structure picture. For example, simulations of, really detailed, in fact, simulations of surface magnetoconvection show that you can actually get a bipolar magnetic region just, in the near surface shear layer in the absence of an isolated flux tube that's, risen through the entirety of the convection zone. So basically, this is the idea of, having structures coalesce as a result of convective turbulence in the surface layers. So basically, the idea here is, yes, something may have emerged, through supergranular motions, magnetic flux, in other words, but the actual process of the bipole forming is kind of independent of that and occurs in the surface layers. And another interesting idea is that, maybe the tachocline isn't as important as, or as well, not, I mean, it's important, of course, but maybe it's not like the standard model where all magnetic flux comes from. And there are some simulations, global simulations, that show how large-scale coherent toroidal structures can spontaneously form via just simple dynamo processes in a rotating convection zone. This is kind of that wreathy toroidal layer at the base of some of the anelastic models that are able to extend to global spatial scales. and also there is work that suggests that magnetic flux that emerges as bipole can be generated just simply by supergranular steel convection themselves, as long as the supergranule is at its base has some toroidal flux that's of the strength necessary to eventually get shoved up into the surface layers. So anyway, there's a lot of different ways to think about this. And one of the goals of at 30,000 feet here of the flux transport and emergence theme is to use it to obtain basically a better understanding of the emergence process in order to better understand the solar cycle dynamo over these multiple scales and across the entirety of the convective interior to the visible surface. So kind of the challenge from at least a theory and modeling point of view is how do you do that given the disparate physical regimes and spatial and temporal scales of the system? And also, how do you make sure that you're taking all the observational data that you can from helioseismology and from surface observations to constrain the modeling? Excuse me. Okay, so now just a bit more granularity. The specific goals of the flux transport and emergence section of the proposal. Excuse me. There are three that we identified. The first is to determine the physical mechanisms underlying the observed emergence of active regions over the solar cycle, which is kind of what I was describing there in the previous slides. And there's two others, a bit more granular. We want to better understand the origin and evolution of magnetic helicity, because helicity being a conserved quantity, although we don't directly observe it. And three, to join observational and theoretical efforts from the helioseismology and dynamo teams to understand what the presence of activity nests and active longitudes reveal about the paths of flux emergence and better understand how these features constrain dynamo models. So that's kind of you're taking observations over a long period of time globally and trying to use those types of observations to constrain models of the interior, just like we use local active region scale observations to constrain models of surface flux emergence. Okay, so, to kind of complete the granularity, going from coarse granularity to higher resolution, basically. The proposal defined a bunch of milestones related to the flux transport and emergence theme. And I won't go into these in detail necessarily, but I want to highlight a couple of things that jumped out at me. So obviously, flux transport and emergence, as all the themes in COFFIES, utilize interactions between teams that don't necessarily, or haven't in the past, always naturally work together. I mean, we work together, of course, in phase one, but the idea here is to get the folks that are concentrating on convection, the solar dynamo, on physics of the surface, and folks that concentrate on model integration, and get everybody to work together to try to better understand some of these global issues. And that includes some of the milestones from the tachocline group. And I guess I bolded one that kind of jumped out at me here, which is basically to better understand the physics of the tachocline. We'll need to start coupling models together. And we proposed a pretty sophisticated two-way coupled model that will be able to connect large-scale dynamo field with observed active region field emerging at the surface. And as such, that would help us. I mean, that certainly could possibly lead to transformational progress. But that's a pretty lofty goal. Anyway, I thought I would point that out. So this slide just shows some of the particulars of milestones that try to couple teams together. So for example, that first bullet just shows how the surface links and helioseismology teams will work together to determine variations of the flows around active regions and how they connect to the dynamics of subsurface layers. So this is kind of using observations at the surface and observations below the surface, and how those observations can inform the modeling, inform and constrain the models. Okay, so, and of course, there's obvious collaborations between convection dynamo and model integration to perform ab initio simulations of the generation of active region scale flux from the base of the turbulent convection zone into the surface. And of course, this is that kind of global coupled modeling that was referred to in that previous slide. Okay. Okay, so sorry, these slides are kind of wordy because I at least wanted to get down in slide form some of our milestones. So I thought it would be helpful as we, delve into phase two. I think the main thing from this first goal, the physical process underlying emergence and decay, is this bolded bullet point here. And this was actually a milestone in our proposal. And that is that all COFFIES teams will work together to create a 3D MHD model of the interior and tachocline, coupled to a radiative MHD model of the upper convection zone operating over multiple scales and producing active region emergence consistent with observations. And so this is kind of the home run milestone here. And I would say that we're going to be spending quite a bit of time to realize this and be successful once phase two is funded. And I'll try to be optimistic here. So I wrote a couple of keywords here because these are words in the proposal that jump out at me and suggest, some of the issues that we're going to be tackling in phase two. And at least from the computational point of view: framework, coupling, assimilation, scales, and physical regimes. And those each present a challenge, and a very significant challenge. I just thought I'd, to remind folks what, for example, the coupling processes just in general. the slide just shows, in terms of software engineering, what coupled models actually refer to and what a framework refers to. And we've actually promised to do both categories of code coupling here in the proposal, fully coupled models down at the tactic line. And in this case, these models, data exchange occurs in both directions, not just from one code to the other, but they have to talk back and forth to one another. And then we also had one of our milestones was to use actual assimilative models in a fully coupled or unidirectionally coupled way to make progress towards our goals. So those are two very different things. I'm running up against my time limit here, so I can't go into too much detail, but I can at least give you a taste of some of the challenges, at least computationally, of putting a fully coupling framework together, which is something we're going to have to. We've actually started something like this in phase 1, except with the convection team and the surface links team. But we did it in the simplest way possible, which is a one-way coupling from some of Nick Brummel's models to some of to the surface models that Dave and I run. And so the challenge here is, this slide is just supposed to show the complexities of different computational domains of different resolutions having to transport data from one another. And the point is that the coupling basically requires you to write specific code that allows for data transfer from block to block. So it's straightforward, but it takes time to do properly and in a general way. And there's not only spatial integration, there's also temporal integration. So for example, when we try to use data to drive models, the data is at a certain temporal cadence and the codes are at a quite different temporal cadence, and you've got to deal with, the physical implications of having those not match. So anyway, our experience with data assimilation, which is another issue entirely, at least from our group's point of view, we've been trying for some time to, in a physically sensible way, to incorporate time series of vector magnetic field data into models of the surface layers. So the CGEM project actually has data available that allows us to do that. In other words, you can tell there's electric field data that's generated from these sequences of magnetic field measurements. So the bottom row here is an electric field that we can then assimilate into the active layers of a MHD model. This happens to be a CGEM's favorite active region, AR11158. So yeah, I don't have much time to go into the physics of what's going on here, but it is assimilative in the sense that, you have an electric field that a code will create just by running whatever initial state you have. And then you have something that the observations are telling you must happen. And you've got to combine that in such a way as to make it physically and numerically sensible. So, and in fact, this is just rudimentary data assimilation, right? Because, the real data assimilators, like in climate models, have tons of data and it's all in situ, right? And they run, these, these models, different models in an ensemble, and then find ways to, put it all together to have the observations guide the actual data. So I think that's probably more than COFFIES is biting off. I mean, we have to deal with remote sensing data. So I think any assimilative effort we try to do is going to be pretty basic. Just my opinion. So, and I'll just finish here by mentioning that there are the other two goals of the flux transport and emergence portion of the proposal also have milestones associated with them. And these are the milestones associated with the evolution of magnetic helicity. And again, it's integrating all the teams of COFFIES together to attack this particular sub-problem. And then finally, the milestones related to the goal of activity nests and flux emergence. So these are those. So if you're interested in kind of digging into this, this is actually recorded. And if people want the slides, I'm happy to give you a PDF as well. I mean, basically the slide set is just kind of digging through the proposal and trying to boil it down to, a couple bullet points, which I think is probably useful as we go forward and plan phase 2. So anyway, I'm going to hand it off now to Amy. So that's kind of the really brief overview of a really complex topic, but hopefully it was helpful. So Amy, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
Okay, before I talk, did we want to take questions related to that topic and material, or did we want to save everything to the end?
If there's a couple quick ones, we could probably take them, but
yeah, it might be easier to stay on that topic and go through some questions if people have them.
Yeah, I'll just kind of reiterate what I wrote in the chat is that, Bill, at some point I would, as someone who doesn't do modeling, it would be really interesting for me as an observer to kind of dig in to at a high level into the code coupling, so I can kind of know a little bit more about how my observations would be.
Oh yeah,
needed.
Yeah, and actually, Shay, I think that's going to be a really important outcome of COFFIES in general, right? Because I think that information exchange goes both ways, right? So
yeah, definitely.
While we can show you, some of the nuts and bolts of how we put code together and how we assimilate or try to assimilate data, I mean, it's important for the modelers to understand the nuts and bolts of the observations, because if we don't, then we're not going to be able to assimilate things in a physically self-consistent way.
Right. There is a hand raised. Sushant, do you want to ask a quick question?
Yeah, what is the status of having a dynamo in the near surface shear layer?
I'm not sure I heard the question. Is it regarding
the presence of
dynamo
a dynamo?
in
the near surface shear layer. What's the status on that?
Oh, well, so yeah, so actually the near surface shear layer is one of the COFFIES themes, actually. So I'm not a dynamo theorist, so I'm not sure I can answer the details of that, but I know that the near surface shear layer is right at the range of what we encompass with our models, basically, which is digs into the near surface convection layers, which I think of as like 5 to 10 megameters below the surface, all the way out into the corona. So that's kind of the range of models that we've done in the past. And what we're trying to do is couple that with some of the global processes that flux is transported from the deeper interior layers. And to properly model the near surface shear layer is going to take some thought, because of course there are global inputs to that. So we have to, again, it's this problem of scale. I mean, how do we, if we want to understand the local environment and local dynamo processes, at the same time we want to understand shear and, the solar cycle dynamo, we've got to figure out a way to couple these, vast spatial scales together. Anyway, I'm not sure if that addressed your question, but that's kind of my thinking on how to model these layers anyway.
I think we can come back to that if we need to after Amy's section.
Okay, does it look like I'm sharing?
You're sharing, but it's in it's not in present mode. Yeah, there you
go. Okay, so thank you, Bill, for giving the overview, which is actually a lot harder than what I'm going to do, which is going to talk about some specific aspect of flux emergence. And, the COFFIES group and our intentions are pretty ambitious, and there's a lot to cover in there, which is kind of great because then, you know, you can find a niche that is interesting. And this is one aspect of Flux Emergence that I've been interested in for a while, which is studying delta spots and specifically using HMI data to study them. And I'm working on a paper with Peter Levins, who's an undergraduate student at Cornell, Mark Litton and Kalman Knizhnik, who are at NRL, and Yang has provided some holisty data, which I'm using for this study as well. So I'll just begin to talk about this topic. Again, it's much more specific or more granular, I think, as Bill said, and you know, doesn't actually cover, you know, a connection to the tachocline, for example, or something like that. But I still find it very interesting, and I hope you do too. Okay, let's see, unpause. So this is just a cool movie. I like to show movies at the beginning of every talk. This is active region 12192, which was a delta spot in October of 2014. It's this large region here. And then here is the radial field strength in a smaller region here. And I'm going to go through the definition of a delta spot and in just a second, but I'm going to tell you what we're trying to do in this paper first, in case you start to do something else during this talk. Maybe you'll remember this at the very beginning. So a delta spot is, in essence, when you have two umbra of opposite polarities in the same penumbra. And it's an interesting magnetic configuration that is quite energetic, and delta spots host a lot of flares and are the origins of many CMEs during the cycle. So it's really interesting for space weather and other things. So how do we get these delta spots? That's a good question. In the paper that we're working on right now, we introduce a new quantity called the degree of delta. Those in the Stanford group have heard me mention this before in our Tuesday meetings. And it's essentially a measure of what the percentage is of the umbral flux of the system participating in the delta configuration. So if you look at, hold on, I have my, here we go. If you look over here at these images that are at slightly different times, a 6 universal time hour and an 18 universal time hour on the same day, you'll see the same system, but the umbra that are participating in the delta is only this portion here, and then all of this portion here. And so it's just a slightly different amount of umbra that are participating in the delta configuration. And this, one of the reasons we came up with this is because we wanted to know, like, how, you know, sunspots are basically, or active regions are categorized as delta regions in, you know, observations, and that's it. They're either a delta or they're not. And it doesn't really address how delta is this delta spot. So this is one way we decided to quantify it. So we isolate different delta spots, and then we characterize their behavior by looking at the lifetime that the umbra spend in the delta configuration, the peak flux that's participating in the delta configuration, whether this delta configuration right here is hail or anti-hail, not the entire thing, but just the umbra participating in the delta, whether that's anti-hail or anti-joy, the delta formation rate, the separation of these flux-weighted center polarities, the rotation of them, and the max flare energy and total flare energy. And also, I just recently incorporated the helicity and twist from Yang's catalog that he created in part for COFFIES. Then we also look at the entire active region and calculate similar quantities, but for all of the umbra in that active region. We also have a control group of beta spots. So the goal for this paper is to better characterize delta spots observed with HMI and determine the percentage of active regions whose observations are consistent with the kink instability or alternatively a collision of two different flux systems that are causing the the delta to exist. And I just wanted to mention quickly that, you know, this work, if you're going to put it in a larger category, it's about what instabilities are acting on the flux to get it into the atmosphere. So, you know, the flux as it rises, as it gets near the surface, it pancakes and then may need to experience an undulate instability to emerge into the atmosphere. Alternatively, convection and convective flows might be large enough, or convection itself might just be pushing this flux into the atmosphere. And whether the flux tubes are highly twisted allows them to stay more coherent. And so they wouldn't pancake as much. And then they might be able to rise as a solid body flux tube with its buoyancy that it has gained as it emerges through the convection zone. How do I move forward? Oh, I click. Okay, so this is an example of a region. And here's the continuum intensity. This is active region NOAA number 11158. We can see it emerging here. Pretty much we capture the beginning of emergence. Here's the radial field strength. The blue and the red contours are the umbra that are participating in the delta configuration, or what's considered delta. And, you know, you can see that these look like two bipoles that are emerging at the same time and kind of running into each other. And what we're plotting here, we look at the amount of umbral flux in the delta in the red line, the flux emergence rate of the umbra, or the delta formation rate. We categorize the degree of delta, which is just the percentage of the total umbra flux that's participating in the delta. We also map on this or plot on this subplot the flare energy with it's times 10 to the -4. So this is X, M, C, I think are here, these lines. And at the bottom plots, we plot the tilt and the rotation rate in blue, and then the total penumbral and umbral flux and the polarity separation. So this code's pretty, you know, it's trying to do a lot actually. But that's basically what we're doing, and I'll show results at the very end. But a quick history lesson here. Kunzel in 1965 defined delta spots as a sunspot group with two magnetic polarity umbra within one penumbra and within 2 degrees of each other. It's a paper that's just in German without pictures as far as I could see. And here's the multipolar. I don't know who knows German, but it's pretty clear that the umbra are entangled and the polarities are in one penumbra here. And then Zirin and Liggett have a very useful paper after using 2 decades of Big Bear Solar Observatory data. 1987, they classified 3 types of delta spots. Famously, I think they coined the term island delta, which is sort of what you imagine when you think of a delta spot in a kinked caused by a kinked flux rope. So that there's 2 polarities. It's like the cartoon of what you imagine. 2 polarities, very compact, close together, and that's called an island delta. They actually use this as an example of an island delta, which isn't as simple as you imagine in the cartoon, but the sun is never as simple as that. That's one type. And then second type would be a single delta spot formed in 2 different stages. So you have a flux emergence of a large spot, and then you have another flux emergence and a opposite polarity umbra appear in the penumbra of the original spot that emerged. And then thirdly, they said they had a category which is delta spots formed by 2 growing bipoles in which the leader of one collides with the follower of the other, which is an example that I just showed you in the movie before. So for solar cycle 24, there were 132 distinct delta spots identified in the NOAA solar region summary reports. Basically 8% of all active regions were deltas. 86% of X-class flares were produced by delta spots. and only 10% of the delta spots produced those X-class flares. So 14 delta spots produced those, and 35% of the delta spots produced M-class flares. So Toriumi and co-authors have been working on this topic and included, took the Zirin and Liggett classification and took it further, creating these cartoons, which they called spot, spot, spot satellite, quadruple, and interacting active regions. The spot spot is basically the island delta from the description by Zirin and Liggett, compact. It's supposedly a kink instability acting on the emerging flux ropes. The difference that I can see in Zirin and Liggett in this Toriumi classification is that they often include active regions with a pretty large polarity inversion, pretty long polarity inversion line, instead of the region needing to be quite compact that Zirin and Liggett described. So that's this one, and there's a cartoon here, and it's a little bit confusing because they're trying to show you the subsurface connection of these tubes, what they think is happening subsurface, but this one doesn't really show the tilt. So the kink. So I put the kink here. And then these two are what they call multi-segment buoyancy situations, where there's a splitting off of a portion of a subsurface flux rope, and there's an emergence of two sections of the same flux rope. So these are the multi-segment buoyancy. The difference between some of these is that the flux emerges all at one time here, and the flux emerges all at the same time here, whereas this can be a delayed flux emergence in the smaller loop. And then there's also the colliding systems interacting active regions. And this one, which leads into a topic that is important to COFFIES, which is these may often occur in activity nests, since there's new flux emerging in the presence of old flux there. So you have an opportunity for collisions to happen. There's a lot of modeling that's been done for delta spot regions, including, what twist does on a given flux tube of a given radius and field strength. I just wanted to show a few things about it, not too much. But this is from a Linton 1998 paper modeling the kink unstable flux tube. And you can see the twist here. And then it is unstable to the kink instability. And you see that kinks develop. But what I think is interesting is this possibility that I wanted to show this to sort of counter the cartoon where you have the full body kink, around its own axis. This is the tube orientation here, if it emerged, would be the tilt would be changed from the classic joy or hail, but not by 180 degrees like you would get in the cartoon where that I showed previously, this one right here, right? It wouldn't be as, the tilt angle wouldn't be as changed if you were given these smaller kinks. This was, I don't want to say it was a limited study, but later studies included multiple kink modes and more tube expansion, and that actually allowed for greater amplitudes of the kink instability to occur. This is a good example of a delta spot forming due to a collision of flux systems. I think this is pretty famous. This is the spot that existed before, and then you see a flux system emerging, and these so interesting how these two regions tried to interact, where the new flux just sort of has to like horseshoe around the old umbra that seems incredibly stable for who knows what reasons. So that's an example of a colliding flux system. For our analysis, we use the SHARP data. we basically we get the delta classification from the NOAA observers, who I might point out are using ground-based data, and calculate or determine whether it is a delta configuration once a day, which I think, you know, we could do better, I think, by using HMI data and having a more frequent determination. But there is a lot of usefulness in maintaining the same system that's been in place for a long time. So we get the delta classification from the NOAA observers, and then look at the NOAA number, find the corresponding HARP number, which is not as easy as you'd think, and then go to the sharp patches, which is what these are. And they're cutout regions of the vector data, and then use those for the analysis. And for the study, we're looking at a small sample of 17 active regions where we look at a lot of quantities. And then we have a beta group that is a control group. So they're more simple active regions. And then we do look at the larger sample, which is all the active regions observed with HMI within 55 degrees of discenter. So this is a larger sample. These are just the tables in the paper that show you what the NOAA number is, the HARP number, the dates, and the classifications, and the maximum flare energy. So this is just another example of what you see when you look at delta spots and, you know, the flux system. This is emerging all at once. It has a pretty long sheared neutral line, and you can see the variations in the degree of delta here in the red, and the umbral flux participating in the delta. And here's another example. You know, the sun does everything it possibly can, which makes it really interesting and really hard to generalize. And in the simulations, I'm just going to mention a few things. Konishnik has a 2018 paper that really works hard to model kink unstable and kink stable flux tubes of different twists, and look at the quantities that we could compare with observations. So unfortunately, like Bill was talking about earlier, it's hard to get the models at a place where they can be directly compared with observations. For example, if you look at this, this is showing the separation distance of the bipoles in time since emergence. For the colors are different twists and kink instabilities. The black is the most twisted, and the green is the less twisted. So you can see like a more twisted kink unstable flux rope doesn't separate in time. And one that is not subject to the kink instability, the bipoles separate, which is what you would expect. But you know, it's just hard because the separation distance isn't what we're observing in the photosphere, and neither is the time, but we can just scale that up. And then how the bipoles rotate about a common axis. The kink instability shows rotation in the bipoles. This black line is the highest twist, so it has the most rotation versus the green, which is the least twisted. So these are quantities we can actively look at in the photosphere. Another quantity is the flux emergence rate, which when it's the most twisted, it emerges fastest, partially because you have like the serpentine fields, like, so it's coming in and out instead of just one U loop. You actually have, you know, 2 or 3 times the flux you see in your system, even though it's the same flux in the axial tube. If it's breaking through the surface at 3 different points, you're counting it 3 times, right? So the flux emergence rate is faster. And then the twist is really interesting. Strangely and disappointingly in the simulations, the higher twist doesn't necessarily result in the higher alpha measure of twist, due to oftentimes the higher twist, you experience a kink instability, or the flux tube experiences a kink instability, and that converts it into writhe, and which isn't measured in the alpha. So there's several things that could happen. Expansion in the upper layers of the atmosphere can decrease what's observed in the photosphere for twist. And there's also some reconnection that I think has sort of like a helicity cascade that can mean you're not measuring it. But basically the twist parameter is not as indicative of the kink instability as you might think it is. So with the helicity catalog, I looked at some of the group. Just recently, I've looked at some of the group of the small samples of the delta spots. This is latitude versus time, with the red being the helicity you would expect in the northern hemisphere, and the blue being the helicity you would expect in the southern hemisphere. And you basically, I basically see 3 spots not obeying this, which is roughly what people that are studying the hemispheric helicity rule, like Sung Hung Park and Yang Liu, would have seen in extensive data sets that they get something like 60 to 70% or something like that of the active regions obeying the hemispheric helicity rule. So I find that kind of interesting that so many of the regions are anti-hail or anti-joy, and yet they're still obeying the hemispheric helicity rule. I'm being a little bit quick here because I don't have that much time. So forgive me if I'm going really fast, but I just wanted to give you a taste of what we're doing in the study. We also looked at the large sample and correlated the umbral flux in the delta, participating in the delta configuration, and that's 10 to the 20th to 10 to the 22nd here on this axis, as well as here, which has been cut off. And then plotting the maximum X-ray flux just for any given active region, what is the max flare that it produced, or the total X-ray flux here, so the summation during the time it was a delta. And there's actually a correlation between the flare energy and the flux participating in the delta. And we fit the exponents of that dependence here, 0.44 and 0.53, and there's more details in the paper. And it has really high R values and low P values, so it's pretty, it's a lot of confidence. Oh, and the takeaway points, which I haven't shown you everything, but the delta spots, what we found from the study, we calculate all those parameters and then we take an average for the delta spots. And the delta spots are in a delta formation for only some of the time on the disk, like 60% of the lifetime of the active region group. Average maximal umbral participation is 77%. I haven't calculated the mean of what they are during their time on the disk. The average delta spot lives longer than the beta spots due to the delta spots have much higher flux, since they're often a collision, or there's just more flux in the region. The delta spots have a higher flux emergence rate, basically 3 times as much as the beta spots, more rotation, less foot point separation, as you would expect by the definition of delta. But in fact, the delta configuration ends as the opposite polarities converge, and the beta spots continue to separate until they're about 60 megameters apart, which is what we think of when we think of dipoles and beta spots. The flare energy is dependent upon the amount of the flux in the delta, which I just showed you. And then this number, I think, is pretty convincing. And also there's a study by Tian, I forget which year, but it's a different solar cycle where they look at almost the same number, like 108 delta spots, but 75% of the smaller sample delta spots are anti-hail or anti-joy, compared to 15% in the control group. But in the large sample of delta spots, 77% of them are anti-hail or anti-joy. And this confirms Tian's results well, or it correlates well with them. The delta spots are found to still obey the hemispheric helicity rule, and I don't have the final numbers yet in terms of classifying what I think are spots, compact island deltas, or interacting active regions, but because I'm still on the fence as to how some of them are behaving. But it's sort of seems like 25% are consistent with the kink instability or the island deltas or the spot and Torini's classification, and then 10% are consistent with collision, which is lower than I would have expected, and the rest seem to be lumped into the multi-segment buoyancy situations. And that's the end for me. Although I did want to do, if we have time, I did want to, maybe while we're asking questions, I can show you the kink instability. Cheating with a phone cord, but we can take questions while I try to do this with my blurred background. We'll see.
Okay. Questions? You can raise your hands.
Oh, should I stop sharing? Well, I'll keep sharing.
Oh, no, you can leave it here.
So I'll try to do this. So this is a flux. This is supposed to be a flux tube, although it's really writhed and not twisted because it's curling around its axis. And you can see when I pull it together like this, it's not kinking. But if I add, oops, I can't really do it. I add twist here on one end in the same direction as the rise.
Stop your share, Amy.
Oh, you can't see me? Oh, okay. I'm doing all this work. Okay, hold on. Stop share. Okay. So I was busy twisting this flux tube, which I said was actually like it's writhing, not it's, you know, because it's coiling around an axis, not like it doesn't have fibers that are twisting along it. But when you start off with it in its sort of relaxed position, which it's not really relaxed, you can see it's not kinking, right? But then if you add twist to it along one end, and it's hard to add twist, it very quickly like kinks like this. So it's just an easy way to show the kink instability. But okay, were there questions?
There are definitely some in the chat. So Mosimi, I don't know if you, or like if Rick responded or if you want to.
There's a young raised hand.
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, when you calculate the index for the active region, for the delta spot, do you use the whole region of active region or only include the delta spot?
Only include the umbra participating in the delta.
Okay.
So it's a little bit different. I know that Samus plot that was just shown in the Holisty presentation shows, it's a great plot, and it shows magnetic complexity in relation to flare, maximum flare energy, and it does show that the deltas and even the beta gamma delta flares more than the beta delta, for example. So the more complex, not more, it has a maximum flare energy that's higher. But that's just plotting an area. So I wanted to show something more related to the delta itself.
Yeah, that's a good idea, because when you look at active region 1115A, as you mentioned, there are two dipoles, the large one and in the middle of delta. So for the parameters you calculate, that really depend on the field of view, which area you really include. I mean, for delta spot, suppose you only include the center delta spot, but exclude the big dipole.
Yeah, so it's an the program, it's automatic. So it doesn't know what I want it to do, and it calculates what umbra, whether there's opposite polarity umbra inside a continuous penumbra. So if the penumbra is touching, even if like there's a penumbra that's sort of elongated and connecting two different umbra of opposite polarities that you may think, okay, that's not a delta. The code says yes, it is, because it's sharing a penumbra. So I know that might be a slightly different than what the observers do, but to quantify it instead of making it subjective, we just went ahead and did that. And I see Mashumi asked if there's more deltas in a certain phase of the cycle. And yes, there are more complicated magnetic regions in the declining phase, where Sarah Yeagley and I looked at that and concluded that that might be happening because there's more chances for collisions to occur when there's sort of declining amounts of space that the sunspots are emerging into. But other people have decided that's not a good explanation. But yeah, there's more, the percentage of active regions that are complicated are higher in the declining phase.
Mark?
Oh yeah, thank you both for nice talks. I'm always been intrigued by something that Bill said in his overview, which is that he mentioned that as active regions decay, they seem to decouple from their subsurface attachments to however it is that they rose through the convection zone. And I was wondering, is there a good, what is the conventional wisdom as to why that is? Is it just an effect of like the near surface shear layer chopping off, mowing the lawn, or how does this happen? Is there a good physical explanation for that phenomenon?
I'm not really aware of a good physical explanation of that. I mean, I can tell you the way I think of it and characterize it. We were thinking about this some years ago in the context, I guess we were thinking of dynamic disconnection, which is a kind of a related thing. But I mean, sure, I think you could get it seems sensible that a shear layer could give it a haircut, but also, I mean, to me, after running lots of flux tube simulations over the years, I mean, it's clear that, if you think of a isolated magnetic structure that is of sufficient field strength to rise buoyantly through the deep interior, after going all that way and interacting with the convective turbulence, by the time you get to the surface and the stratification becomes more, more extreme, right? The convective turbulence has more of a chance to act on those fields that are spread out in the first place. So, I think it's a combination of things. It's just that the regime of the surface is a lot more stratified and the scales of the turbulence are different. And I think of it as part haircut, part gnawing, of things, right? So I mean, clearly, it sure seems like it becomes disconnected. I mean, obviously, magnetic field just can't utterly become disconnected, but I think what happens is that the field is run by the flows rather than the magnetic field suppressing the flows, if that makes sense. And that's related to the beta, plasma beta and the dynamics of the surface.
It sort of suggests that there's some threshold field strength. And once an active region decays below it, then it will become disconnected. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's fair, but
okay.
Yeah.
But what are the signatures of the disconnection? What are you saying? Why are you saying it's disconnected at a certain point?
Oh, well, I mean, like flux transport models are really good at describing, the transport of flux, at the surface, right? But that just, presupposes that the flows are acting on the field and there's no back reaction of some global structure under the surface that's resisting that, right?
So is it just when the umbra starts to break up?
Yeah, I don't myself, I don't tend to think in terms of umbra penumbra. I just tend to think in terms of what we see at what we measure at the surface and what the field strengths are at depth, at the top of these structures and ropes. It's just, I mean, at least from the modeling point of view, it's clear that, I mean, after all, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it was really hard to get a really strong flux tube to get to the surface in the first place. And even if you did, it would get shredded near the top of the surface layers. And so the old idea was you needed a crap load of twist to get it to make it through the convection zone. And that's even in the absence of convective turbulence. So yeah, I mean, I guess I think of the disconnection in that, gee, we can explain lots of things with a 2D flux transport model, and that's way different. I mean, it's 2 dimensions on a surface than the 3-dimensional stresses associated with isolated structures below the surface, if that makes sense. Or I could just be babbling. But yeah, I mean, Mark, to your point, for sure. I mean, this is the type of thing that I think will be great to study in COFFIES, right? Do
we see evidence of, like, when you look at some sunspots, they have like bridges and stuff in them, which are often believed to be, sort of like fractures in the umbra where some convective activity is happening. Do we see those things expand into, like help to break up a sunspot? Because I've always thought that sunspots sort of decay from the outside rather than from these, but I don't know. I haven't looked at that many active regions.
They have these cores, right, that then split up again. Sort of strangely, the way they assemble is the way they disassemble. But I mean, they seem to have these cores that then break up again as they're splitting up. So that's where you first see the umbral cores. It looks like more like quiet sun in between them. I don't think they're light bridges.
I see Gustavo has his hand up.
Yeah. Thank you, Bill and Amy. Very nice talk. I have 2 questions, one to Amy and one to Bill. To Amy, I like your demonstration of the kink instability. So my question is, what is giving to this magnetic structure the extra twist that you add in the phone cord to make it complex, and why others don't have this extra twist? Is there any knowledge about that? And to Bill, you mentioned something about data assimilation, assimilating the electric field. What is the goal of assimilating this field?
You first, Amy, or?
Okay. Well, I think that part of studying delta spots is to try to understand that. And part of studying the hemispheric helicity rule is to try to understand where the twist is coming from, whether it's imparted by convection, imparted by a structure where the field originates, whether that's at the tachocline or I guess there's two ways that I see it written about in the paper: the current induced twist or helicity, and then the convective given. Like, so one sort of from the inside, and then one's from the convection. And I think I don't know what the general idea is right now from the hemispheric helicity rule. Maybe Yang or Sung-Hung could answer that, like whether it's thought that is from convection or from an initial configuration from the toroidal field.
And from the general Coriolis force that basically follow the hemisphere rule. But if the flux have the sufficient twist and lead to the kink instability that cause the sign of twist would be the same as the original one. That really depends on what caused the twist. What is the origin of the twist?
Yeah, but what do you think the origin of the twist is?
I don't know.
Okay,
But
I don't know either.
Right, but if you look at suppose the kink instability, suppose the highly twisted flux rope initially rise, and the hemisphere rule basically 50 to 50 for that set, this type of flux rope. Means the origin of the twist does not have very strong hemispheres preference.
Just in addition to Bill's comments, one way to violate the hemispheric sign preference is if the rising flux tube encountered strong downflows and converging flows, then actually the twisted flux tube will have the opposite sign of twist. I mean, against the hemispheric sign preference. That's one way, but again, there are many ways to violate the hemispheric sign preference. So, and of course, the origin of the twist, I'm also interested in. So.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of mechanism people discuss, like a sigma effect, like an omega effect. All of those effects actually give to the twist that follow the hemisphere. But kink instability that rarely come from the very origin of the twist, which the origin still need to investigate.
Maybe this is a naive question, but does it not have anything to do with the shearing and the tachocline that would like start the twist?
I suppose.
Yeah, it could. I think that's the easiest. Let's just put it at the tachocline. That way we don't even have to try to observe it, right?
Yeah, Gustavo, you have to answer this question.
Well, if it's the shear, the tachocline, all of the spots will have twist, the same shape.
Well, that's assuming that the shearing in the tachocline is uniform.
Yeah.
But this way, would that twist follow the hemisphere rule? It is, right?
I don't know.
So before I forget Gustavo's other question, let me quickly insert an answer. And so basically, to paraphrase your question, Gustavo, is basically how are we going to use, what possible use would be these electric fields to assimilate from our context, right? So let me answer that by first giving you the motivation of why we did it in the first place. It was for a different problem, for a different group. Basically, we wanted to use vector magnetic field measurements to drive coronal simulations of eruptions, basically. So we wanted to have a more, a more data-driven kind of way to characterize a particular eruptive event based on observations. But the way we chose to do it, and we're still working on this, it's a very, very difficult problem. The way we chose to do it was, instead of applying some sort of MHD boundary condition, rather we decided to use these inversion techniques to have a physically self-consistent electric field that we could put in the active zones of our simulations. So when we were first thinking about actually talking about the surface links group, working group 4, at the beginning of phase 1, it occurred, one of the questions we were asking is what do things we observe at the surface really inform our understanding of what's going on from a magnetic structure perspective at depth? And just as a kind of a brainstorming thing, I thought, well, so we're using these electric fields to drive, putting it into our, convection, outer convection zone, or in the CGM case, just kind of a model photosphere. We inserted those electric fields into active regions. There's nothing technically that says that we can't insert those electric fields like in the middle of our domain, right? So then you can conceive of an assimilative scheme that if your photosphere is in the middle of your domain and you have stuff going on below it and above it, provided you could find some sensible way to set up an initial state, which of course means you have to kind of know what the structure is in the first place, which is a hard thing. You could eventually, and it might be useful to think about assimilation in terms of, also affecting the layers below the surface as well as above. So that was basically the idea. The reason I even brought it up is because we had in one of our milestones assimilation in there. I just wanted to kind of define it, at least what I've tried to do in terms of, rudimentary assimilation with in situ data.
Thank you.
Okay, if no more questions, we are actually already over time. So let's thanks to the speakers again for the wonderful talk and the very nice discussion afterwards. Thanks to everyone. And so see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.